Hi everyone, I'm Jacob Lackner, and it's Thursday, so that means it's time for a history video. So far, this channel has focused on rather specific topics, but I'm trying out different formats, and this time around I want to do something a bit different, a top 10 video. As a historian of the Middle Ages, I'm often asked questions about medieval Europe that reflect some major misconceptions about the time period. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the 10 I hear the most, and then explain why each of them are misconceptions. At number 10, I have the idea that the Middle Ages were a dark age. In terms of how often I hear this one, it is actually number 1, but I decided for it to be the one that I talk about first, because it helps set up most of the rest of this list. People weren't walking around during the Middle Ages, calling it a dark age or a middle age or anything else. It was just the time that they lived in. People living in a time aren't usually who assign the name to the time period they're living in. Instead, it's people who come after. And the idea of the Middle Ages being a dark age is something that emerges from the pen of the founder of humanism, Petrarch. Petrarch believed his own time was a renaissance, a rebirth of the classical period. For him, the Middle Ages were a dark age where there was no progress, life was short and brutal, and so on. This allowed him to construct his own period as a great leap forward, and it's a period he helped make himself, so, he's a little self-serving there, and he thought of his time as returning to the time of the ancient Greeks and Romans. In fact, we get the term Middle Ages from Petrarch too. Medium aevum in Latin literally means the time in between, or middle period. For Petrarch, that middle period was a deviation from the greatness of the classical period, and thus a middle period existed between his own time and the great classical period. Later humanist thinkers like Erasmus would further this view of the Middle Ages, and it pretty much became entrenched. Erasmus was critical about any aspect of the church that he thought of as medieval, and wanted to return the church to the classical period, which is basically just a religious version of the Renaissance's rejection of the Middle Ages. This further became the narrative in the wake of the Protestant Reformation. The Reformation itself was partly inspired by humanism, especially the idea of the power of the individual and the importance of individual study especially, and it took this idea of the Middle Ages being a bad, dark period and ran with it. For reformers, the Middle Ages were a dark, brutal time during which the church dominated everyone and harshly regulated people's lives, and this was only fixed by the Reformation. So there's a lot to unpack here, but suffice it to say, the narrative of a dark age does not line up with reality. If you want to say there is one, you can maybe make an argument for the very early Middle Ages, from about the year 500 to 700, as being a dark age. During that time, we have very little in the way of documentary evidence, and there was a fair bit of chaos, and it was probably a low point in terms of education and progress. But after 700, the Middle Ages become a pretty vibrant time, only becoming increasingly so with the passage of the years. In fact, Petrarch wasn't even the first person since the fall of Rome to want to emulate those classical people. That happened during the reign of Charlemagne, who initiated the so-called Carolingian Renaissance. Charlemagne's motto was Renovatio Romanii Imperii, or Bring Back the Roman Empire. He oversaw a movement that sought to emulate the Romans in art, architecture, and culture. He was even crowned as a new Roman emperor. One of the best ways to point out that the Dark Age narrative is completely false is to look at one of the outcomes of the Carolingian Renaissance, which was the creation of what was then called Carolingian minuscule. The ancient Romans wrote in all capital letters without space between words. Because Latin was their native language, they were able to read such a text easily. But by the 8th and 9th centuries, no one was speaking Latin as a native language, and it became very difficult to read. So, Charlemagne's scribes developed a new way of writing that would be easier to read, and it involved lowercase letters, punctuation, and space between words. When Renaissance humanists went to the archives in search of the style of writing they wanted to emulate, they actually thought that the Carolingian minuscule had to have come from the ancient Romans, because it looked better than the script that was actually written by the Romans. Renaissance humanists' adoption of this type of writing is what has led to it being the way we still write today, so you can thank the Middle Ages for the fact that we write in a much more easy-to-understand way. A few other things greatly complicate the narrative of a Dark Age as well. For one thing, there is an urban revolution at the end of the Middle Ages where people really start moving to cities. This is something that really helps lay the foundation for the larger cities of the Renaissance. And one of the institutions born in these medieval cities was universities, which would be important centers of education and progress. It is after these medieval institutions that modern universities are still modeled. In reality, the Renaissance was built upon foundations that were laid during the Middle Ages. It was not something that sprang out of nowhere and resulted in a completely different world, the way Petrarch would have you believe. Now, this narrative of a Dark Age is something that has spawned several other incorrect assumptions about the Middle Ages, and we're going to see those as we proceed through this video. At number 9, I have the idea that Primae Noctis was a thing. So, if you're not familiar with this, and I kind of hope you aren't, but you probably are, and it's the idea that feudal overlords had sex with subordinate women on their wedding nights. This appears in a ton of literature based on or in the Middle Ages, and most famously appears in the film Braveheart. Since it shows up so much in popular culture, people often assume that this was a common practice that was universal throughout feudal Europe. Problem is, we have exactly 0 sources that actually date to the Middle Ages that mention this practice, and you can bet that if it was happening, there would have been some intense discussion about it, especially in the church. I mean, in last week's video, we talked about a decades-long debate about a goose, so of course they would be talking about Primae Noctis. So, there would certainly be some record of discussion about this issue, but there isn't. The first time we have this practice mentioned isn't until 1527, when Boethius says that it was a practice in place in the Middle Ages. This is something that Renaissance and Enlightenment thinkers would seize upon as an example of how backward the Middle Ages were, but it just isn't based in reality. It's certainly possible that this was happening in some places, somewhere, and perhaps there's some kernel of truth, but it is certainly a mistake to think that this practice was widespread or commonplace, or a real part of the feudal system. At number 8, I have the idea that Europe was isolated and didn't have any significant contact with people from elsewhere in the world. Oftentimes, people seem to think that Europeans knew nothing about a wider world and they were completely isolated from all outside influences. Now, even if we set aside the obvious example of the Crusades, where Europeans leave Europe and go to the Middle East, there are plenty of other examples of long-distance trade and exchange of ideas. This is especially true during the later Middle Ages, during the so-called Pax Mongolica, a period where the Mongol Empire encompassed pretty much the entire Silk Road, during which time it was much easier for Europeans to travel eastward and for Asians to travel westward. Marco Polo is, of course, the most well-known example of a 13th century adventurer who went east, but he is but one example of many, and he may not have actually traveled east. There's some controversy over whether he actually did or if he made it up. But either way, people were traveling east during the time of Marco Polo. Lots of important technologies came across the Silk Road during this time, including printing technology, paper, gunpowder, and more. Of course, plague also traveled along the Silk Road, so not being isolated wasn't always a good thing, but the point is that there was frequent interaction between medieval Europeans and people who lived far, far away. At number 7, I have the idea that there was little technological progress in the Middle Ages. And the way Petrarch casts it, you would assume it was a time when nothing new or important was invented. The way he tells it, medieval people forgot all Roman technology. You'll sometimes hear the popular apocryphal tale of medieval people seeing Roman aqueducts and believing they were built by God or the devil because they thought it was impossible for any human to have built them. But this just isn't true, especially by the later Middle Ages. By then, medieval people had mastered engineering and architecture enough to build truly massive churches. And sure, they weren't trying to emulate Roman style. They did their own things, like making arches pointed, for example. But you can't really look at a Gothic cathedral as anything other than an architectural wonder. Worth noting, by the way, that the moniker Gothic given to late medieval architecture is also a product of the Renaissance. The Goths were one of the Germanic groups whose activities led to the end of the Western Roman Empire, and Renaissance architects looked at the architecture that was produced then as something produced by the descendants of these barbaric people. In reality, the Goths as an ethnic group hadn't really been a thing for hundreds of years when Gothic cathedrals began to be constructed. These projects often took 100 years to complete, showcasing a degree of continuity and planning that would be impossible if medieval people were as backward as is often imagined. There are many other important technologies that originated in the Middle Ages too, like the first cannons, the first windmills, and more. Depending on how you want to date the Middle Ages, some people go all the way to 1500, well, that also includes Gutenberg's printing press and important navigational advances like new compasses that enabled the whole age of exploration. At number 6, I have the idea of a chastity belt. This is something else often depicted in popular culture of the Middle Ages that didn't really exist in the Middle Ages, and certainly not on the scale people often believe. The idea behind a chastity belt is that a medieval lord would make his wife wear it while he was away, and this would keep other men from having sex with her. Only the husband had the key. The narrative one often hears is that this was something that nobles who went on crusades did to make sure their wives went untouched, but yeah, that's not remotely true. The first reference we have to chastity belts is in 1405, and the crusades are over by 1291. Even with the reference in 1405, we don't have any other examples of them anywhere near that early. They were probably in some isolated use in 1405, but the oldest chastity belts that have survived to this day are from the 16th and 17th centuries, and we don't see them mentioned regularly until then either. In other words, chastity belts are a product of early modern Europe, and not medieval Europe. At number 5, I have the idea that all medieval people thought the Earth was flat, and this is part of a larger misconception, the idea that medieval people knew nothing about science. So according to this narrative, Christopher Columbus was a big deal because he knew the Earth was round and no one else did, and that's why no one would give him funding to sail west because they were worried he'd sail off the edge of the Earth. That isn't remotely true. Most ancient cultures figured out the Earth was round, some as early as 1000 BCE, with the Greeks not only able to figure out it was round, but they also figured out its circumference using math alone. Everyone who was educated in the Middle Ages knew the Earth was round. It was something that was what we might consider common knowledge. And the reason people didn't want to fund Columbus's expedition is because they thought he was wrong about the size of the Earth, and it turns out he was. He thought he would sail west to Asia, but there was a whole hemisphere in the way. At number 4, I have the idea that Christianity and Islam were always in conflict in the Middle Ages. This is a very clash of civilizations narrative that various people refer to on a regular basis today that isn't really reflected in reality. The idea here is that these two faiths had blinding hatred for one another, and neither could allow the other to continue to exist, thus they fought wars against each other all the time. This is false. Now, I'm not saying all Muslims and Christians were best friends either, but there's a lot of nuance to be had here. For one thing, if we look at Spain, it was a multicultural place, and whether you lived in the part of Spain where Muslims or Christians ruled, you could generally find Muslims, Jews, and Christians living alongside one another, working as business partners, and even developing friendships and romantic relationships, and as we saw in an earlier video, playing chess with one another. Even if we take the unique case of Spain out of the mix, it's important to note that before the Crusades, there was no long-standing military conflict between Muslims and Christians at all. There had been intermittent conflicts in Spain, but characterizing these as part of some organized war between the two parties is unrealistic. There was a lot of time between the various conflicts, and there were often interfaith alliances during both the Crusades and the so-called Reconquista in Spain. So if it was all about religion, that kind of thing wouldn't be happening. And another way to look at this is, if the two sides really hated each other so much, why didn't Christians do something about Muslims conquering Rome in the late 7th century? Why did they wait until 1095 to react to the fact that Muslims controlled the Holy Land? Well, because it wasn't just hatred of Muslims that motivated the Crusades. It had to do with specific groups of Muslims, the Seljuk Turks, who were not as tolerant as their predecessors had been. Pilgrimage to Jerusalem, which had been safe for Christians for centuries, was suddenly no longer safe under these new rulers. Meanwhile, the Seljuks also conquered a ton of territory, not only from Islamic powers, but also from the Byzantine Emperor, and he asked for help from the West, and that's really what generates the Crusade. And yeah, there was certainly hatred between some medieval Muslims and Christians, but it wasn't ever present, and it wasn't everybody. I mean, even during the Crusades, the time people really like to refer to as this clash between the Islamic and Christian civilizations, there were frequently friendships and alliances and all sorts of other things going on between Muslims and Christians. I actually did the very first video on this channel is about alliances between Muslims and Christians during this time. So everything's way more complicated than being able to say Muslims and Christians hated each other in the Middle Ages and they were always at war with one another and they wanted to destroy one another. At number 3, I have the idea that the Inquisition was constantly arresting people and using so-called medieval torture devices on them. Now, I'm not here to tell you that the Inquisition didn't originate in the Middle Ages. It did, but the medieval Inquisition was not this highly organized, violent, and well-oiled machine that people envision. Inquisitio was a method of legal investigation that involved looking at a particular person and investigating them, and then bringing them before you to ask them questions after you've interviewed a bunch of witnesses and have all sorts of information about them. This method originates in the Roman Empire, and it was borrowed by the Church starting in the early 13th century, but there was not a unified inquisition at any point during the Middle Ages. Basically, people were given the title of inquisitor, but they all kind of did their own thing, their own way. Some of these inquisitors were harsher than others, but for all of them, torture really wasn't that common. Generally, the way things worked is, you would be brought in front of an inquisitor, he would ask you questions, and if he concluded that your beliefs were outside the boundaries of what was allowed, he would ask you to recant your beliefs. If you did, you were free to go, and that was it. Now, obviously, from a modern perspective, this is religious persecution, and that certainly isn't good, but it also isn't the torture people envision. Now, torture was a thing that was resorted to sometimes when someone would not recant their beliefs, but even then, it was pretty rare. Even rarer was people being executed. The concern of the medieval inquisitor was someone's soul, and while they certainly had an impressive way of showing it by modern standards, one thing they tried to do was avoid executing people who had not recanted. People regularly refer to medieval torture or medieval torture devices, but the reality is most of the things people are referring to when they say that are from the Renaissance and early modern period, like the rack, or even later, like the 19th century Iron Maiden, which people seem to always think is a medieval torture device. One Inquisition that was highly organized and brought new meaning to the word was the Spanish Inquisition, which didn't begin until the 1460s. It was more invasive and aggressive than those that came before, and it became especially intense in the wake of the Protestant Reformation. That's where we see torture and execution become more common. This is especially true of the Inquisition's activities in the Spanish Netherlands. So, in short, people project later ideas of the Inquisition to the medieval Inquisition, and while that's where this religious investigatory court was created, torture and execution were very rare. On a related note, the witch hunts people often think about are also from the early modern period following the Protestant Reformation. They're not medieval either. And number 2, I have the idea that during the Middle Ages, everyone was pious and nobody ever challenged the church. This is another narrative that was constructed in the wake of the Renaissance and Protestant Reformation. This narrative states that before Martin Luther, no one stood up to the church because everyone was kept in line by an all-powerful institution and they all had to listen to them and be pious. But as you know, since it's on this list, this is a false narrative. First of all, when talking about medieval piety, it is definitely true that people were pretty pious and probably more pious on average than we are today, but not everyone was. One of the things I've spent a lot of time studying in my research are what are called sermon exempla. These were formulaic, short, illustrative stories that preachers generally said in a neighboring community, and the stories were always contemporary ones that people could relate to, and not something just referencing the Bible. These stories had some big moral at the end and were intended to be entertaining. These stories became really popular tools for preachers. One preacher who helped popularize this method was Jacques de Vitry, who in a collection of exempla he wrote, noted that parishioners are much less likely to fall asleep and more likely to come to church when he utilizes exempla. In other words, even medieval people fell asleep during church and skipped out on it. The exempla itself was meant to keep people engaged and it wouldn't be necessary in a world where everyone was super pious and loved going to church. Now, the other idea to tackle here is the one that before Martin Luther in 1517, nobody ever challenged the church. In reality, just like the Renaissance, the Reformation was built upon medieval foundations. Some of Luther's core ideas were that the Bible should be available in people's native tongues, that the church's insistence that sacraments were necessary for salvation was false, that monasticism was pointless, and that the Pope was too powerful. Luther himself was a prolific reader, and a lot of those ideas were things he got from medieval thinkers who proposed the same thing. In particular, John Wycliffe of England and Jan Hus of Bohemia. Both were focused on getting the Bible in people's native tongues, limiting the power of the church and the papacy, and eliminating monasticism. Jan Hus's movement actually gained some level of success and permanence as several separate crusades against them were defeated, and they were allowed to actually change some of their beliefs, but still exist under the umbrella of the Catholic Church. Now, this isn't to say that what Luther did isn't a big deal. It is. His actions result in the shattering of Catholic unity that encompassed all of Europe, and this is something that earlier reformers hadn't accomplished. Someone like Jan Hus, his whole movement is basically contained to Bohemia. Luther went a lot farther than Hus and Wycliffe ever did in challenging the church, and he had access to the printing press, allowing his ideas to spread rapidly throughout Europe. So the Protestant Reformation is a really big deal, but Luther himself would tell you that he built upon the work of people like Hus and Wycliffe who are often forgotten. And at number 1, I have the idea that Jews were constantly persecuted and unwelcome in medieval European society. This is at number 1 for me because my main area of research is medieval Jewish-Christian relations, and as I discussed in my video on medieval anti-Semitism, there certainly was persecution of Jews. I'm not disputing that. What I am disputing is a direct narrative running from the persecution of Jews in medieval Europe all the way to the Holocaust, a narrative that you hear a lot. The book that I think most powerfully dispels the idea that Jews were always persecuted in medieval Europe is Jonathan Elukind's Living Together, Living Apart. He argues, in short, that while persecution was a thing, it was generally a disruption of the norm, a norm where medieval Jews and Christians were often friends, neighbors, and so forth. If you really look at the persecution of the Jewish people in medieval Europe and you put them along a timeline and on a map, it becomes clear that these events were generally sporadic and didn't occur everywhere in Europe. Again, I'm not disputing that anti-Semitism was a problem in the Middle Ages. I have another video where I say it is. I'm just saying that the image people have of angry mobs murdering Jews on a regular basis isn't based in reality. It happened, but it was not the norm. This last misconception about the Middle Ages does a good job of allowing me to segue into talking about what I'll be doing in next week's video, which is delving a little bit deeper into this very topic. As I noted, I've already done a video on the dark side of medieval Jewish-Christian relations, but next week I'm going to do the opposite and talk about some of the numerous examples of peaceful medieval Jewish-Christian relations. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it. If you like the idea of more top 10 videos, let me know in the comments. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on some of the other videos I've already made, including some that I mentioned in this video, you should see some of them on your screen now. Thanks for watching.